The footage you're currently looking at was shot on one of my favourite lenses. It has this warm, filmic look, and whilst it's not very sharp, it kind of adds to the charm. It has this incredible bokeh when you pull focus, but what I find so cool about this lens is it was originally built for CCTV cameras. And best of all, you can pick one up right now for less than $30. Now, this lens has gained a lot of popularity over the last 10 years on blogs, and some videos have been made and articles posted about it, but it still remains pretty widely unknown to most filmmakers. And when we consider the explosion of popularity of repurposed vintage lenses by indie filmmakers like the Helios, I can't believe this lens hasn't been spoken about more. Considering how cheap it is and the unique cinematic vintage look you can achieve with it, I really feel it's an underutilized tool for the independent filmmaker. Introducing the Fujian GDS 35mm f1.7. The GDS 35mm is a CCTV lens built as a robust lens to attach to CCTV and surveillance camera systems. These lenses were produced in China and seem to have been pretty mass-produced and have quite an industrial design to them. This lens is absolutely tiny. In fact, it's so small that seeing it mounted to a cinema camera, even a pocket one, is quite amusing. Here it is mounted to my BMPCC 4K. I'm using an adapter ring to fit this lens onto a micro 4/3 mount of the Blackmagic, but of course other adapters are available for a few different mounts. On the lens itself we have a manual aperture and a manual focus ring, and it does look like a CCTV lens because that's exactly what it is. So just to give you a bit of context and backstory about how I first became acquainted with this lens, it was 2022, I was in New York making a short film with my friend Eric Norcross, and early on we were kind of getting some test shots and sort of deciding how to shoot the film, and he brought along his Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Now this is the original 1080p version that has that really cool 16mm look. I'd love to do a separate video on that, but he brought with him an array of lenses for us to try, and I remember one of them was this tiny little lens that just looked really interesting, and I said, what's that one? And I remember it was in this sort of clear plastic sandwich bag, and he said, oh, this is an ex-CCTV lens that's kind of been adapted to go onto the Blackmagic camera, and I just thought that was like the coolest idea. But looking at it, I expected it to be a sort of wide angle lens or something. And so when we went out test shooting that day, I said, let's try out that lens. And so Eric got out this lens and we got this shot of my character kind of having this moment of realization. And now this shot actually ended up being in the final film at the end of this kind of chaotic montage in Times Square. There's this moment of kind of realization, and for that you can actually see the shot that we got on the Blackmagic using this lens. But I remember watching that clip back and just being stunned that this tiny little lens was able to produce this image, and how kind of surreal it was, but also how cinematic it looked, and how lovely the bokeh and the depth of field was on it. Eric could tell I was really excited by this lens, and very kindly at the end of my trip he basically said I could take the lens with me as a gift, as he thought I'd have more use for it and use it in my own film work when I returned to the UK. Now here's where things get quite interesting. Depending on the adapter you're using for this lens, it can essentially be used in two very distinct and, in my opinion, very cool ways. This could be used as a macro lens or as a kind of general 35mm lens that acts as you would expect with a kind of 35mm focal plane. Now when I was gifted this lens, I noticed something odd about the adapter that I had, and that was when I put it onto my Blackmagic camera, it had a very interesting focal plane. I had to be very close to the subject to focus, and I basically had macro abilities on this lens where I could get really in close to subjects and focus in a way that I hadn't expected, and I was a bit confused by this at first, so obviously I did a bit of digging and a bit of research, and what I found is that the adapter that the lens had come with essentially had too much distance between the sensor and the lens, and so essentially shifted and worked as like an extension tube, shifting the focus and making this kind of like a macro only lens. But I actually loved the way it looked, and in fact in the examples I'm going to show you momentarily, I was using this adapter which essentially made this into a sort of macro style lens, and quite often I would literally focus just by position of the camera, which obviously is technically a bit of a strange way to do it, but I actually had a lot of fun doing that and just kind of finding that balance between the subject. But I went ahead and bought another adapter which seats the lens at the correct distance from the sensor to allow it to basically have the focal plane that you would expect. And of course this did so, and depending now on the adapter which I use, I can use this as a kind of close-up macro lens that gives me some really cool characteristics up close, or I can use it as a wider lens. And what I love when you use this as a wide lens is you kind of get this kind of chromatic aberration / vignette blur to it, because obviously this lens was not designed to be put onto a cinema camera. But why I think this is so cool is because it essentially makes this lens a lot more versatile and gives you a lot more options. For just the price of a cheap adapter, you can essentially extend out the capabilities of this lens and have almost like a 2-in-1 macro lens with a 35mm lens that has a really cool kind of filmic chromatic aberration / vignette blur look to it. And so I'll leave the name of the adapter which turns it into a macro lens on the screen. However, I don't know if they still produce adapters, if this is intentional or not. I suspect it would be, but again, just an interesting little thing that I haven't seen covered with this lens. And obviously I'm sure it works for other lenses with different adapters, but it's just something that made this a lot more versatile and I just wanted to add. Now, I just wanted to quickly share a real world example of a project I actually used this lens on. Now, this is a film called Pay As You Go that came out in 2024 that I shot back in 2023. It was very much a sort of spontaneous project. Pay As You Go follows a man who struggles to socialise, he can't talk to women and he struggles to make new friends. He gets invited to a house party and decides to go along, but when he gets there his friends abandon him and he struggles trying to make new friendships and connections. It results in him feeling rejected, he leaves the party early, he goes home, eats junk food and rings up a phone line where he talks to a young woman and tries to unload his life problems, only to find that he's run out of credit and has been speaking to himself for the remainder of the call. Now, whilst looking back, I think this film suffers with some pacing issues. I'm really pleased with what we achieved with this film, and we kind of experimented. And in fact, one of the shots on this film was also shot on a camcorder, but the end scene where he makes this phone call, which is kind of the pivotal emotional point of this film, I decided to use the close-up lens and try and shoot the whole thing. So what we had is an actress on the end of a real phone who was there waiting to be cued by an assistant director. And essentially we did this I think 3 or 4 times, and we had him really cool up and improvise this whole scene, and I just wanted to get it in one take. Now it ended up being a little bit longer than perhaps is suitable for a short film, but we ended up getting something which I thought was really, really touching and personal. Now using the Fujian lens in this scene really helped just create that intimacy that I needed, and I just love the bouquet on it, especially at this, there's this last moment where he basically realizes that the phone has hung up and he basically tilts his head back, and I pushed in, and I just looking back at that shot, there's just something about the way the background swirls, and especially with the black and white grade that I ended up going with, it just has a very unique feeling combined with the music. And whilst I had other photography lenses at the time, this is before I had access to Sigma lenses or cinema lenses that I could use and utilize. But actually, even looking back now, there's something about this shot and the characters of this lens that just feel really unique and specific in a way that I think makes it look a lot more cinematic than if I'd gone with a very clean, kind of obvious choice. And so that's just an example of one project where this lens really came in handy and really saved the day, and in my opinion really enhanced the story that I was trying to tell. But I think what I'm trying to really get across in this video is it's not about the gear that you have, it's about how you use it. And I think that used in the right way, a $30 CCTV lens can be a more powerful filmmaking tool than a really expensive, I guess let's say like a Sigma art lens if you're starting out. Let's say you got like a Sigma art lens or something compared to this. Now, one might be more conventional of a choice, one might have a cleaner, sharper image, but if you don't know how to use it and you don't have the right creative, I guess, instincts, then ultimately it doesn't matter what lens you have. And of course, the more you develop your skills and move up in whatever discipline you're following, it is true that obviously having access to better equipment can be helpful, but I'm talking about filmmakers starting out, and I think it can be so easy to get caught up in the idea of spending hundreds or thousands of dollars on a lens before you actually know how to use a lens to its best ability and when or where you might employ different lens types. So I'm all for sharing equipment like this lens that is very accessible for starting filmmakers, but also has the ability to give you a really powerful cinematic image. So I hope you got some value from today's video, and if you end up getting one of these lenses and filming something with it, I'd love to see what you do. Go ahead and leave that in the comments of this video or a future video. I'm going to try and make more kind of DIY filmmaking tutorials / techniques, tips, videos going forward. It's been quite busy recently. I've been working on some stuff which I'm excited to share when I can, but as a result, it's been harder to make these videos, but I'm going to continue to, when I have the time, make these videos, and thank you for everyone who's been supporting the past videos that I've done. Thank you.